At 9 o'clock in the morning of Friday, May 8, 1931, the directors of Creditanstalt, Austria's largest and most prestigious bank, arrived without appointment at the offices of the Austrian government and the National Bank of Austria in Vienna. What they brought with them was a document they had spent the previous days hoping would never have to leave the building. The document was Creditanstалт's balance sheet for 1930. It showed a loss of 140 million Austrian shillings. That figure represented 85% of the bank's entire equity capital. The bank had been insolvent for months. Its directors had known. Now the government knew. 3 days later, on May 11th, Creditanstalt made its public announcement. It was unable to publish its financial statements. The wording was careful. The implications were not. By noon, lines had formed outside every Creditanstalt branch in Vienna. By the end of the week, depositors had withdrawn enough to triple the National Bank's banknote liabilities in 7 days. 3/4 of everything withdrawn was immediately converted into foreign currency: dollars, pounds, francs, anything that was not the Austrian shilling. Creditanstalt represented 27% of the entire Austrian banking sector's total assets. It was larger than all other Austrian banks combined. Its liabilities were equivalent to 16% of the country's entire gross domestic product. There was no institution in Austria large enough to absorb it. There was no precedent in modern banking history for a failure of this proportion in a country of this size. What happened in Vienna that week was not a local Austrian banking story. It was the match that lit a fuse running through Germany, through Britain, through the gold standard, and directly into the economic catastrophe that would define the decade. Most people have never heard of Creditanstalt. That is the first thing the history of the Great Depression gets wrong. To understand why one Austrian bank could unravel the finances of an entire continent, you have to understand what Creditanstalt was and what it had become by 1931. The bank was founded in 1855 as the Österreichische Creditanstalt für Handel und Gewerbe, the Austrian credit institution for trade and commerce. Its founders were Salomon Meyer von Rothschild and his son Anselm, with the backing of the Austrian Finance Ministry. From its first year, it combined two roles that modern banking has since separated. It was both a commercial bank, taking deposits and making loans, and an investment bank, holding ownership stakes in Austrian industrial companies. At the peak of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Creditanstalt was one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. It financed railways across the empire's vast territory. It held equity in steel mills, textile manufacturers, chemical plants, and mining operations from Vienna to Budapest to Prague. Its balance sheet stretched across what is now 12 separate countries. Then the empire collapsed. The Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 divided the Austro-Hungarian Empire into its successor states. Creditanstалт's network of industrial investments, which had been spread across a single integrated economic territory, was suddenly fragmented across 12 new nations with 12 new currencies, 12 new sets of trade barriers, and 12 new political jurisdictions. The bank that had been built for an empire was now confined to operating in a landlocked republic of 6.5 million people. The industrial companies in which Creditanstalt held stakes were struggling. Trade across the former empire's territories had collapsed. The bank's equity investments were generating losses, not returns. And rather than acknowledging the problem, Creditanstалт's management made a series of decisions through the 1920s that made it worse. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us, and we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse? The 70s oil shock? The end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. In the fall of 1929, the same months that the New York Stock Exchange was collapsing, the Austrian government made a decision that would seal Creditanstалт's fate. The Creditanstalt, Austria's second-largest bank, was failing. Its industrial loan book was in ruins. Its equity stakes were worthless. Left to its own trajectory, Creditanstalt would have gone into insolvency. Its depositors would have faced losses, and the Austrian banking system would have been forced to confront the structural problems it had been suppressing since the end of the war. Instead, the Austrian government pressured Creditanstalt to absorb the Creditanstalt, to take its assets and its liabilities onto its own balance sheet, to become the rescuer rather than allow a public failure. Creditanstalt complied. The rescue was announced. The Creditanstalt ceased to exist as a separate institution. What Creditanstalt had actually done was absorb a catastrophe into itself. The Creditanstalt toxic assets did not disappear, they transferred. And they transferred into a balance sheet that was already under significant strain from a decade of accumulated losses in its own industrial portfolio. By the end of 1930, Creditanstalt was carrying the combined weight of its own deteriorating investments and the Creditanstalt failed ones. The loss that its directors delivered to the Austrian government on May 8, 1931, 140 million shillings, 85% of equity, was the product of both. The Austrian government had believed it was solving a banking problem by engineering a private sector merger. What it had actually done was concentrate the entire problem into one institution, the one institution in Austria that was too large to fail and too large to rescue domestically. The stock market crash of October 1929 is where most histories locate the beginning of the Great Depression. But the institutional chain that turned an American financial crisis into a global economic catastrophe was forged in Vienna, not New York. In a government office where officials decided that concealing a banking problem was preferable to confronting it. The announcement of May 11 did not immediately reveal the full scale of Creditanstалт's losses. The Austrian government and the National Bank intervened quickly, providing emergency liquidity support and negotiating with the Rothschild family and other creditors for additional capital. The official messaging was controlled. The run, however, was not. By the end of the first day, it was clear that no amount of careful official language was going to stop what was happening at the bank's branches. The queues did not disperse, they grew, and the pattern of withdrawals told a more alarming story than the headline numbers. 3/4 of the money being withdrawn from Creditanstалт's branches was not being redeposited elsewhere in the Austrian banking system. It was being converted directly into foreign currency. Depositors were not simply moving their money from one Austrian institution to another. They were concluding that the Austrian banking system as a whole was no longer trustworthy, and they were converting their holdings out of Austrian shillings entirely. This was not merely a bank run. It was a currency crisis running simultaneously. The Austrian National Bank was hemorrhaging foreign exchange reserves at a rate it could not sustain. Its legal obligation to maintain the shilling's fixed exchange rate, the peg that tied Austria to the gold standard, required it to sell foreign currency and buy shillings at the official rate. Every time a depositor withdrew shillings and converted them to dollars, the National Bank had to supply the dollars from its reserve. In a week, those reserves were being depleted at a pace that threatened to exhaust them within weeks. The Austrian government assembled an emergency package. A first international loan was arranged. It was not enough. The terms being demanded, particularly by France, attached conditions that Austria found politically unacceptable. The rescue negotiations collapsed almost as fast as they began. By the end of the week of May 7 to 15, the National Bank's banknote liabilities had tripled to just over 1 billion shillings. The fixed exchange rate was under direct attack, and the contagion was already moving east, toward Hungary, then toward Germany. The crisis that began at Creditanstалт's Vienna branches did not stay in Vienna. It could not. The banking systems of Central Europe were too tightly interconnected for a collapse of this magnitude to remain contained. German banks had lent heavily to Austrian institutions. The panic that was depleting Austrian reserves was simultaneously being transmitted through correspondent banking networks into Germany. German depositors watching the crisis in Vienna drew an obvious conclusion. If Austria's largest bank could fail, what did that imply for the stability of German banks, which faced many of the same structural problems? The same post-war debt burdens, the same struggling industrial clients, the same dependence on short-term foreign borrowing to fund long-term domestic positions. On June 6, 1931, the German government announced that it could not make its scheduled reparations payments. The announcement was not directly caused by Creditanstalt, but the Creditanstalt crisis had accelerated a loss of confidence in German institutions that made the admission politically unavoidable. On July 13, 1931, the Danat-Bank, one of Germany's largest, closed its doors. The German banking system went into a 2-day bank holiday. The Reichsbank was losing gold at a rate that threatened to exhaust its reserves within days. Germany exited the gold standard on July 15, 1931, just 65 days after the Creditanstalt announcement. The crisis then crossed the Channel. Britain had been financing its own balance of payments deficit through short-term borrowing from institutions that were now themselves under pressure. Gold was flowing out of the Bank of England. On September 19, 1931, 131 days after Creditanstалт's announcement, Britain abandoned the gold standard. Within weeks, 25 countries followed. The interwar gold standard, the monetary architecture that had been painstakingly reassembled through the 1920s as the foundation of international trade and financial stability, was gone. Austrian unemployment surpassed 25%. Germany's economic decline exceeded 20%. Britain's economy contracted sharply. The Great Depression, which had begun as an American stock market crash in 1929, had become a global catastrophe, and the mechanism that transformed it was a banking failure in Vienna that most history books do not mention by name. The Creditanstalt crisis might have been contained if the international community had moved decisively to provide Austria with the external support it needed. The tools existed, the precedent existed. The 1890 Bering rescue had demonstrated that a coordinated international response could prevent a systemic banking failure from becoming a systemic economic collapse. In 1931, that response did not come, and the reason it did not come was not primarily financial, it was political. In March 1931, just 2 months before Creditanstалт's collapse, Austria and Germany had announced plans for a customs union. The arrangement was economically modest, a reduction in tariffs between two neighboring countries, but it was politically explosive. France interpreted the customs union as the first step toward an Anschluss, a political union between Austria and Germany that the Treaty of Versailles had explicitly prohibited. France was not prepared to accept a stronger Germany on its eastern flank under any circumstances, economic or otherwise. When the Creditanstalt crisis broke in May and Austria urgently needed international financial support, France held a card. It was the primary creditor for the loan Austria needed, and the key player whose cooperation was required for any multilateral rescue package to be assembled. France made its position clear. It would not provide financial support to Austria without Austria abandoning the customs union proposal. The negotiations were not primarily about banking architecture. They were about geopolitics. Austria refused. The customs union was a matter of domestic political pride as well as economic policy. Abandoning it under French financial coercion would have been a diplomatic humiliation that the Austrian government judged it could not survive politically. The result was a rescue that was too small, too late, and too conditional. The contagion spread while diplomats negotiated. By the time the political dimensions of the crisis had been partially resolved, the financial contagion had already crossed into Germany, and no amount of Austrian stabilization could pull it back. This is the pattern that recurs throughout financial history. Crises are economic events. Their resolution is always partly political, and when the politics fail, when national interests, geopolitical rivalries, and domestic constraints prevent the coordinated response that the economics demand, the crisis deepens beyond the point that economics alone can repair. The history of the Great Depression is usually told as an American story. The Wall Street crash of October 1929, the bank failures of 1930 and 1931 in the United States, the Dust Bowl, the breadlines of Chicago and Detroit, Roosevelt and the New Deal. That account is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The American crash of 1929 was a severe economic contraction. What turned it into the Great Depression, the decade-long global catastrophe that destroyed the savings and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries, was the European banking crisis of 1931. And the European banking crisis of 1931 began in Vienna, on May 11th at the offices of an institution that most people today have never heard of. The lessons of Creditanstalt are precisely documented and consistently ignored. The first lesson: banking systems concentrate risk invisibly. Creditanstалт's insolvency had been developing for years before its directors walked into the Austrian government's offices on May 8. The losses were real, the trajectory was visible, and the institution continued to operate as if nothing were wrong because acknowledging the problem was politically inconvenient. This is not a story from 1931. It is a story that recurs in financial history with clockwork regularity. The second lesson: forced mergers of distressed institutions transfer rather than resolve problems. The Austrian government's decision to push the Boden-Creditanstalt into Creditanstalt in 1929 did not save the Austrian banking system. It concentrated its problems into one institution that then became too large to rescue domestically. Every subsequent generation of financial regulators has had to relearn this lesson, sometimes in countries that had studied 1931 carefully. The third lesson: international financial crises require international political coordination, and that coordination is systematically blocked by the same national interests that make the crises dangerous in the first place. France's refusal to rescue Austria without geopolitical concessions is a 19th century story told again and again in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the European debt crisis of 2010, in every IMF negotiation where political conditions are attached to financial lifelines. On May 11, 1931, Creditanstalt announced that it could not publish its accounts. 131 days later, Britain left the gold standard. The interconnection between those two events was not coincidence, it was mechanism. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through, or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.